So welcome everybody. My name is Sam Hill. I am the Ambassador and Senior Research Fellow at the Federalism Index Project. And we are here today with Rodney Smith, who is the Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies. Rodney, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sam. It's a privilege, and thank you for all the work you do within the center. It's exciting. It'll be good to get back together again soon and feel all of that buzz.
It really will.
With 20 or more of you all working furiously in those quarters, it is an exciting endeavor.
There is a great energy to working together with everyone. And I must say, I look forward to getting back to that. Could you introduce yourself to us a little more and perhaps tell us a little bit about your books that are the basis for our interview today?
I would be happy to. I won't give you the whole biography, but I was born in a small town, which for me was a real blessing. I was exposed to such a wonderful variety of individuals from such diverse backgrounds, and we're great friends. And I had teachers who cared deeply about me, who really helped change my life. And so then I went on, and I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy, and then I started into graduate school at the University of Virginia, and then left to run a campaign, a congressional campaign for a friend. And then I went to law school, and after law school I went into practice, but I really wanted to go into teaching. That became very clear to me, and so I asked my dean, what did I need to do? And he said, well, you should go get an Ivy League degree. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania and did a master's and a doctorate. And that really, in that doctorate, was when I got into, I began to really become enamored with James Madison one day. As I was studying some arcane material, I got a little bored. It was about 3:30. And I just went to forage the shelves, and there I find this wonderful book, Rives' book, the earliest biography on Madison, written really by a man much younger than Madison, but a friend. And I just was enthralled. And so I've spent years studying Madison, and ultimately teaching constitutional law. I had two areas of interest. My dean said, you have to have two areas of interest. I know you want to do constitutional law, but you have to have something else to build a reputation on, because it'll be much easier to do that. So I picked sports law, a brand new topic. And then I'd often have people say, well, how could you do constitutional law and sports law, and particularly the First Amendment? That was what my dissertation was about, the first 16 words, the religious liberty, and how can you do that and be interested in sports law? They seem so separate from each other. And I would always respond, well, if I'm going to study sport, the religion of the American people, I probably ought to be interested in the First Amendment too. I was directing, I put together a sports law and business program at Arizona State at university. I was at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and my counterpart was in the Graduate School of Business, the Carey School of Business at Arizona State. And we put this interdisciplinary program together on sports law. And then I get a call from Matt Holland at Utah Valley University. And Matt, I knew him. We weren't friends, but I've known him for a number of years, and he said, "Hey, Rod, why don't you come to UVU and work at our Constitutional Studies Center and make a lot less money and, but a lot more difference." And I just couldn't turn down that opportunity. So I have returned to the area that really has always captivated me more than any other. And I love our mission at the Center for Constitutional Studies. It's very simple. It is to increase constitutional literacy in a nonpartisan way. And now, nothing is more important to me in my life right now than my grandchildren and the world that they're blessed to grow up in. I have 28 of them, and I just can't think of anything I could be working on that would be more important to my grandchildren than constitutional literacy.
Well, we are really glad to have you here, Rod, for not just your boundless energy for this, but also for the expertise that you have brought. And for those of us who are watching, Rod is a great champion of the students and their success, and so he has been a great blessing for the center. So thank you, Rod. I want to get into James Madison a little bit. Madison comes from a time when the supposedly nonpartisan country that Washington envisioned had decayed into profoundly vicious partisanship. And yet he didn't seem to view partisanship as necessarily bad. Why?
Well, he was in many ways a vigorous partisan. His partisanship becomes tempered later, and that's my second book on Dolly and James Madison, An Unlikely Love Story That Saved America. Well, she has a real influence on him, and she tempers him in some wondrous ways, and she's a very, very capable counselor to him in every sense of the word. It's an incredible love story between two people you'd never think of getting together, but he was nevertheless a partisan. And even under the influence of Dolly, who tempered him, he remained very much a partisan. I think that's the nature of every time. It's not whether we're going to have partisanship, it's how we deal with it. And he, in the first 2 years of Washington's term as president, many referred to him as Washington's prime minister, because for example, I love telling the story. Washington's first inaugural, Washington puts this address together, and it's, I think, 70 pages. And Madison said, no, that won't do. So ultimately, he comes to Mount Vernon on his way back to the Capitol and stops to help, and really, in fact, writes Washington's inaugural address. And so then he gets to Congress, and the president delivers the address, and Congress has to decide, well, who's going to respond to it? So Madison, who's America's great draftsperson and the greatest lawmaker, is given the assignment. So here he's written the inaugural address, and now he responds to it,
rebutting himself a little bit.
Yes, and now in order to preserve the power of the presidency, Washington feels that it's incumbent on him to respond to Congress. So he asked Madison to write the response. But that's a good way of introducing the kind of this relationship that Madison had with Washington as sort of his prime minister first, but then they begin to divide. Washington becomes more a federalist, if you will, and Madison is leaning in and more Hamiltonian, and Madison is leaning in the direction of Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, and ultimately Madison becomes the party leader in Congress. But the relationship was very different, and we were deeply blessed as a nation to have George Washington as our first president. And when people ask about what quality was his greatest quality, in my opinion, it was that he was deliberative. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means he sought after opinions on each side. There were a few issues that early in his presidency that were more electric in a partisan way than the national bank. Mm-hmm. And Madison is opposed to the bank. Later in life, he comes around when he's president and so forth and supports it. That's an interesting issue in itself. But Washington is persuaded more and more by Hamilton. And yet three times he invites Madison to the White House to make his case. The third time is the night before the decision has to be made. Either it signs it or he doesn't sign it. And Washington decides to sign the legislation, but he had asked Madison three times to offer his views. What we have to come to understand about partisanship is, and good lawyers learn this, is that we more often get justice when we have vibrant arguments being made from both sides and then have the wisdom to balance them, because more often than not, and it's true in virtually every dispute that's currently the source of a battle, there tends to be truth on both sides. And so that was the big difference, was that they understood, and we certainly wouldn't have had a constitution if they didn't understand this. They had real disagreements, but they understood that the United States required that they find a way to clearly to permit all that kind of dialogue and then resolve it. And now what Dolly did that was so artful was she would have these parties every week, and she'd bring people from differing viewpoints together. They would come to be friends. Many of my closest friends are people I disagree with greatly on, even in the constitutional space, or constitutional lawyers I disagree with. We have 9 great justices. They all disagree, but they're all close and respect one another. And that's what Dolly taught, that you respect the rights and the views of others, and you have a better government.
So this is not so much a partisanship, especially with James and Dolly, of good and bad, where they work against each other, but one view and another view trying to come to something.
Yeah, no, that's right, Sam. You're not evil because you disagree with me. In fact, I relish that. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's sit down and talk. and in the world of legislation and of getting things done, and Madison was an artisan at that. You have to sit down with the other side. You build friendships. And you work out your differences. And the beauty is, so often, the balance you arrive at is more true, is better than either one of the views standing alone. He begins to see how important that deliberative style is. So Washington persuades him to be deliberative, and Dolly brings him out of his shell. And one of my other favorite stories is, of course, the Jeffersonians and Adams. Jefferson and his supporters and Adams and his supporters have no love for each other, because the campaigns then were much uglier than they are today. Much worse.
What people may think today, it was worse in the old days.
Yes, yes. Now it was done through surrogates, so the candidates kind of stood back and said, "Well, it wasn't me," you know, but they were vicious, and so the Adams family did not feel any real affinity for the Jeffersonians, but you at one of these gatherings. Somehow James and John Quincy Adams begin to talk and begin to play chess together. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, they solve a problem that changes America. And it was the Louisiana Purchase. You see, Jefferson did not want to sign the purchase, because he didn't believe the president had the power to do it. And indeed, he didn't under the Constitution. So they have a problem. And John Quincy Adams suggests to Madison, who's Jefferson's Secretary of State and really responsible for this, well, James, I'll help you because I believe in it. Just make it a treaty. And now we'll have the separation of powers come to our support. The executive will offer it as a treaty. We'll consider it. And if for some reason it's not constitutional, the third branch of government, the court, can tell us it's not. And that's the way we got the Louisiana Purchase. And it began to bring the Adams family and the Jeffersonians back together. And in fact, it is John Quincy Adams who offers the great eulogy to Madison when he dies, and suggests at the end in a very moving way that future generations must listen to the still small voice of James Madison, because you see, he always spoke very, very quiet. He was very hard to hear. He didn't boom. Jefferson said he was the most eloquent person he knew, but not because of the way he spoke. It was because of what he said.
Hmm. Now you bring up an interesting point of powers, and powers are a major question that seems to have come up right now. Who has what power? Now, as this interview is part of Federalism Month, and we're looking at very specifically some of the issues that have emerged in federalism as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump has made some statements that have raised eyebrows. A number of governors on both sides of the aisle have taken actions that are stirring controversy. And despite this, and despite 200 plus years of constitutional history, we're still having this argument of who has what power. Can we take a look at Madison's actions and perhaps draw some lessons there on how to resolve this question.
Well, I mean, I think Madison would have taken some delight, not in any way in the virus. Those kinds of issues were very personal to him. You see, prior, I think it was Grace Mallon who talked about the yellow fever. Well, Dolly was directly affected by the yellow fever. She just had her second son, is just months old. The yellow fever hits. Her husband sends the family away because if they could get them away from the mosquitoes, they could be safe. But he had to go back to Philadelphia, and he tended to his parents, lost a father, and then he contracts the virus, and he makes his way back. It's not contagious, and he makes his way back to Dolly, and Dolly says, and dies. But the very day that he dies, the infant son had also contracted it, and it's an awful disease. They become yellow. That's why they call it yellow jaundice, and they throw up till there's nothing left. It just racks them. And so on the same day, she lost her baby and her husband. She was a young woman then, and that really shaped her character. So they cared deeply. He would care deeply, very deeply, about people that were harmed and hurting. But he would relish what's happening with regard to federalism. He would relish
time for him for federalism. This would be a good time for him in federalism.
Oh yes, oh yes. He would, the very virtues. Again, as Troy Smith talked about, this notion of a covenant. It would be something that Madison would embrace wholeheartedly. It's a covenant between the states and the federal government, and there has to be interaction. And in fact, it does two things. One, that interaction helps protect liberty, because it's another check. No, neither the states nor the federal government are all powerful, so they work together. And Madison would have relished this period to see Eastern states coming together in consortia and saying, here's our idea. California coming with its idea, Utah coming with its idea, and creating a national dialogue. Now, I think we as a people should pay more attention to the dialogue and take a look at both the science. See, we're having to do, this is one of those classic cases, we're having to balance this awful virus with economic concerns that are also awful. So we're in deep need of a variety of voices. Again, what's happened is too many people just quickly gravitate to one side or the other instead of listening. And Madison believed that states should interpose or petition the national government, should say, and especially on issues like liberty. So we have some states doing lockdowns and some not. I think he'd have said, hooray, hooray, hooray. Because we now can look at a variety of views. In a scientific sense, we can also evaluate what seems to be working, and we'll be able to do that. And if we'll just step back for a moment, for a Madisonian moment, and say, look, all that we're going to learn in this period is just going to be wonderful. But it's a revitalization of the voices of the states and federalism. And there are a lot of things the president does I don't care for, but I applaud that he sort of said to the states, I want you to be free. Now it's hard for him not to say, well, I don't. The states he doesn't like he jumps in and attacks, but the federalism is working wonderfully, I think.
It reminds me of the laboratories of democracy idea. Where you have 50 laboratories of democracy, you have 50 chances to try and figure out, how do we manage this best? And then I suppose the lesson we can take from Madison's, the Madisonian version of partisanship is, rather than isolate to our camp, rather engage with partisanship and say, I think this is right. I think this is right. Look at what happens, figure some things out, and then very frankly, honestly say, I think on the balance, this is what we've learned.
I think that's right. And I mean, one of the fun things about President Trump is he's taken both views. He said, I have all power. And then on the other hand, he said, no, it's all you. So he's argued both cases. It's always difficult to argue both cases well, but but that's right. We have a chance to have this kind of dialogue, and again, Madison he didn't believe in a thing called states' rights. He believed that the people speak through the state. The state of Utah is just an organ of the people of the state. They're a voice for them, and he believed that multiple voices would check each other when any began to become tyrannical, mm-hmm. but they also could then come together and reach. And I think that this was solidified for him in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He would have agreed wholeheartedly with Franklin that there were things he didn't like in the Constitution. For example, he wanted, on impeachment, he wanted the Supreme Court to hear it, not the Senate. That he felt very strongly about that. But he didn't win everything. But on balance, they ended up with a document that has served this nation so wonderfully. And so I think they, as a generation, came to believe that this partisanship wasn't a bad thing as long as you kept it reined in so that it was facilitating discussion.
So no letting partisanship run amok, keep it controlled, like reins on a horse.
And federalism was one of the ways, Sam, they did that.
Yeah, to direct that power productively. And so you bring up an interesting point about the idea of states' rights, which is such a contested, tempestuous discussion today. It almost sounds like, and I think this is an imperfect metaphor, the states are almost like a corporation to the voice of the people, where, instead of having 10,000 voices all saying, we speak for Virginia, Virginia speaks for all 10,000 voices. Is that?
Well, they also, you'll remember that the large states, the small states, and they understood that the voices of the states would be different, mm-hmm. And that they would be reflective of the people. Having said that, Madison was, in the Constitution, he and Hamilton were really allies in many respects. Now, Hamilton took the position that we don't even need the states. He gave a long discourse. He didn't speak much in the Constitutional Convention, but he gave a long discourse about the uselessness of the states. Well, Madison didn't agree with that. Madison, nevertheless, did believe that state laws should be vetoed. at the federal level. So he also recognized we need a federal government, and the federal government in the coronavirus has, when it's operating at its best, it's making sure they're ventilators. It's doing things that only a federal government can do.
Mm-hmm.
And they believed, of course, the federal government was to protect you against enemies, foreign and domestic, and this is and to play a special role. So they have a special role, but so do the states, to be able to be reflective of the diverse voices of the people. Mm-hmm. And that way, all these voices that might be minority on the national, the Utah position wouldn't be the national position necessarily, but it is reflective of the people of Utah. And that's a good thing. And it protects their liberty, protects their, it provides for tiers of democracy that they have a voice at each of the levels. Mm-hmm. And you bring it even down to the local level, it's even more so. So it's just, it's not designed to be efficient. It's not designed to be protective of the freedoms and the voice of the people. And federalism facilitates that. It's not efficient. China's proven that they're handling it efficiently.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they don't have press freedoms as we do, and so they're able to hide behind matters. Today, they're using the virus as an excuse to limit the liberties of the people of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have that. We didn't opt for tyranny. We didn't opt for efficiency. We opted for a federal system. We opted for separation of powers, bicameralism. We added a Bill of Rights, all of this to protect people.
You spend a lot of time in your books talking about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and I am reminded by what you just said. It's something that perplexed me a little bit as I was reading, is that he talks about this freedom of the press, and frequently it ends up coupled with conscience. And initially that struck me as sort of an odd coupling of, why can't we have opposition press and conscience? Is this why?
Well, that's such a great question, Sam, because you're getting the essence of the book, and it is so interesting. It doesn't appear. Jefferson, you see, does the Kentucky resolution, but Madison largely does the Virginia resolution and the Virginia report. And interestingly enough, John Marshall, who Chief Justice, does the minority report, and they're battling over the Adams administration believed that the Jeffersonians were engaged in what we would today call fake news. Well, some of it wasn't true, but some of the Adams, the Federalist press wasn't true either. They both had a proclivity to exaggerate to satisfy their readers. Is that new? No, that exists today too. So that was what was going on there, and but Jefferson and Madison want to ensure that the federal government can't regulate press. And why do we have a free press? Now, remember, the first right in the First Amendment is the right of religious liberty or conscience. The next is, and Marshall goes to pains to say, well, government really can do little to regulate religious liberty, but it can't establish religion either. But then there's a bridging, and that applies to the freedom of the press and so forth. But the press itself, why do we want the press? Well, we want the press to express those, it's a vehicle by which we can communicate to others our conscience, that which is most important to us. So you see, the whole First Amendment's interdependent. If you limit the freedom of speech, you're going to limit the freedom of the press, you're going to limit religious liberty, you're going to limit the right to petition, you give the government the power to limit the other. It was created to be interdependent, all designed to protect our conscience, to protect our right to be able to engage in a dialogue about that. If you're an environmentalist, about the environment, whatever is whatever is a part of your conscience, you're able to do, and that's really being protected there. So you're right. And he said they were. I wondered the same thing. I read the first time he said that the freedom of the press is an inalienable right. Freedom of the press. Well, the only way it gets to be an inalienable right is if it's reflective of our human dignity or our conscience.
So much of what they did in the Bill of Rights and Constitution seems designed this way, where they remembered because they knew their history, that when you take this step in the direction of encroaching on a liberty, the other steps tend to follow. And so it seems like they pushed that fence out as far as they could, and even I suppose left a little more on the field than they could have taken justifiably to make sure that nothing crossed that border.
Well, that's right. You've just, and that's where Madison gets to the 9th and 10th Amendments and says, well, look, if we've missed anything, the states can provide more liberty, or we can decide under the 9th Amendment that we haven't provided enough, in part because he realized, in my book, particularly the second book, I really go into the slavery issue in great detail. And I don't excuse Madison, but I do explain him. And he knew there were issues incomplete. It's sort of the euphoria of 1787 to 1793, from the Constitution to the Bill of Rights. He really believed we've set in motion the freeing of the slaves.
Now, I'd like to get back a little bit to a discussion of states. So Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they emerge because the federal government is saying, hey, we're going to control how you do these things. And I assume that the people who were in support of the First Amendment and concerned about the power of the federal government said, well, you just gave it to us and now you're taking it away. And so you get this articulation of nullification and interposition. And some people use them a little interchangeably. Some, even back then, some people seems to try to use them interchangeably, but they're very different things. Can you give us the primer on the two?
Yeah. Thank you, Sam. I'm glad you raised that, because it was so critical. And Madison spent much of the latter part of his life, again, always talking about conscience, but he talked a lot about slavery, and then he also talked about keeping the states united, and that it was the people of the states being united in the United States. And he coined the term interposition. Jefferson used nullification. Nullification with the Tariff Acts and so forth, and John Calhoun begin to become the rallying cry of the secessionists. Interestingly, Madison had dealt with secessionists too. They just happened to be in the North. These secessionists used the notion of nullification. We have the right to. So when they passed the Tariff Act, they said, well, we believe it's not constitutional, so we have the right to declare, to refuse to enforce it, to nullify it. Madison didn't agree with that. Madison said you have the right to interposition. And that means, and that's part of why he would have loved what's happening today with the states exercising, essentially petitioning the national government. But interposition for him was you interpose yourself. You say, wait, federal government, before you do that, you need to think about these issues. And Madison had grown in an area. Today, only 3% of the American people know what a petition, that the right to petition their governments also protected in the First Amendment as a matter of conscience. But the states can petition, and if they do it collectively, it becomes powerful. So you have both Kentucky and Virginia, and ultimately, all of the steam behind the limitations on the press lose their power.
Now, one of the, because we've been hearing, they call it a con, they call it an Article 5 con, the idea of proposing an amendment to address many of the problems. In the book, you point out that for Madison, that was the last resort. And interposition was an earlier, interposition encompasses all of this, but there were two earlier steps. Can you talk to us about those earlier steps?
Well, the earlier steps are to exercise, first of all, our rights that were given and to exercise them effectively. And then on the federalism, and he's given us all these, we've got the House of Representatives, we've got the Senate, and they're actually working, if they talk to each other, they could be pretty effective because they represent varying voices. So we speak through those varying voices. Mm-hmm. We have the press, we speak through the press. So we have a variety of means that we can turn to. And then we have, if all that doesn't work, you can turn to interposition, and the states can get together and say, here's our case. Take it seriously. The beauty of that, it also requires the states to articulate well their case, not just to pontificate.
So we can't just bluster and spew. We actually have to put some thought into this one.
Yeah, and get data and make your case. Nobody could make a case better than Madison. Now, he didn't win all the time, as was the case with the National Bank, but he could really make the case, and so could others. And when you really make the case on both sides, all of a sudden, a middle route generally appears. And that's been part of the genius of America. We've had a government that creates a way of voicing all these tensions, but then coming to a middle road. That's why people want to say, hey, well, what party are you in? And what are you? I'll say I'm a Madisonian moderate. I love the system. So let's not throw out the system until we work it.
Yeah.
That's my response to my Article 5 friends and their friends. And I feel for some of their pain. I just think there are processes that are out there that they ought to take advantage of and really make their case. And I don't think they've taken the time to make the case. And I will also tell you, as much as I admire all of them, I haven't found a Madison in the bunch yet. And remember, it's the Madisons and people like him, and there were many, James, Wilson, Pinckney, you could go on and on. Great voices. Will we have the same great voices if we hold a convention? Or will we have these dissident voices of just that are created by, elected by caucuses and conventions that are designed to be highly ideological and highly adverse to compromise?
Which then, I guess, begs the question of, if our system is having problems, and if the mechanisms that we currently have created and empowered are prone to create this destructive partisanship, what do we have to do to revert to or cultivate the healthier partisanship where it is a meeting of minds and a seeking of a middle way?
Well, one of the things we, Dr. Cole at Oxford, who is the genius behind the Quill program project that we work with, where we're doing state constitutions. We've done the Constitutional Convention, Bill of Rights, working on the 13th to 15th Amendments, done the 19th Amendment. We're what really trying to do, it really is a question of constitutional literacy. We need to be a more literate people, because the part of your statement that I would take some umbrage at is our system hasn't failed us. We failed our system. We've been blessed with a wonderful system, right down to federalism. And we use it so poorly because we hardly know it. Only 1 out of 3 Americans can name all 3 branches of government, and yet the interaction of those 3 branches of government are designed to protect and promote liberty and good government, not efficient government. And compromise. They were designed for that purpose.
Yeah.
I didn't want the most efficient builder to build my house. I wanted the best builder that would think about all the problems and build well around them. So I had to wait 4 more months than I might have liked to for my home to be finished. But it's a beautiful home, well built, because they took the pains and the time to do it well. And we have a system designed to build a custom house.
So, in closing, Rod, I want to give you the last word. In this COVID moment, where everything that we see, everything that we hear focuses on this disease and the responses to it, what would you like to see going forward in the American response?
Probably 3 things. A respect for science, a respect for our history, a respect for the rights of others. I would like for us to realize, as Madison did, that compromise and moving forward, and we've seen some of that with some of the efforts to deal with it at the national government level, and we'd probably have to have a 4th effort. Now, I wish in that regard that they'd also bind themselves, as Madison and Hamilton did, and when good times return, we're not going to give more tax cuts, and we're not going to spend on more programs. We're going to pay down the debt. So I wish they'd do that, but it is. I'd like for them to for us to relish how well our system is working, and to use it well. And of course, in the process, I think we should even if the life, I'd close on a personal note. My wife is in a care facility. I haven't been able to really see her, and I haven't been able to even hold her hand for months through all of this. No life is dispensable. The loss of every life should be cared about. And yet, in all of that, we do well to respect others and to also have some sense of humor. Dolly was wonderful when they'd have a party, and when things got slow, or especially if things got tense, kind of look over and wink at James. He knew the signal. She'd get up, her chair, and she'd bend over. You see, she was 5'8", and she was buxom. She probably weighed 40 more pounds than James, and she'd kind of lean over, and he'd run around the table and jump on her back. He'd run around the table and deliver him back at his chair, and she'd go to her chair. And all of a sudden, there was that sense of humor. Or Madison was also a raconteur, and he could tell a good story. There's sometimes in the midst of all this tension that maybe we should take our views and take ourselves a little less seriously, and take the other a little more seriously.
Well, thank you, Rod. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for what you do in the center, Sam. You're terrific.
Thank you so much. So for those of you who are watching, let me encourage you, find them, buy them, read them, and then give them to your friends. They're wonderful books. They do what I think a good history book should do, which is it tells you the story by telling you a story, as opposed to just sort of dragging you through an endless list of names and dates. And I must confess that I laughed out loud at the thought of our president on his wife's shoulders galloping around the table. So they're an enjoyable read. Thank you so much, Rod.